Okay, well, welcome to CSAC. I'm Scott Sagan, Professor of Political Science and Senior Fellow here. And it's a real pleasure for me today to introduce a friend of long-standing and former squash rival from Harvard days, Joseph Nye. Joe has a long career as a distinguished service professor and former dean of the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard. In the government, he was the Deputy Undersecretary of State and chaired the National Security Council Group on Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons. He also chaired the National Intelligence Council from 93 to 94, and from 94 to 95 was the Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security Affairs. He's a prolific and widely cited author, having produced 14 academic books, more than 200 articles, and I'm very jealous that he has also written a novel. Recent books include Soft Power, The Future of Power is the American Century, and the just off the press, Do Morals Matter? Presidents and Foreign Policy from FDR to Trump. Always the professor, he has a scorecard which looks suspiciously like a grade given on different criteria for different presidents, and I hope he'll tell us about some of that today. This book is just out, available on Amazon, and also available right outside the conference room. So without further ado, let's welcome Joseph Nye.
Well, thank you, Scott. It's a pleasure to be back at Stanford, which this will be my third visit, and it's always very, very nice to be here. And I should say it's a great pleasure to speak in the Bill Perry room, since I worked for Bill Perry in the Pentagon. And it's also nice to see Scott Sagan. I knew Scott Sagan when he was a young man.
With blonde hair.
Any case, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about this book that Scott mentioned, Do Morals Matter? Presidents and Foreign Policy from FDR to Trump. But I'm trying to keep my remarks down to roughly half an hour so that most of our time can be discussion, Q&A, rebuttals, and so forth, which is much more fun. I can always hear myself lecture, but I can't always get your view. So if I go on too long, poke me with the squash racket. When I saw a friend a while ago, a couple of years ago, and she asked me what I was working on, I told her about the book and the title of the book. He says, her comment was, good, it'll be a short book. And that essentially is the conventional wisdom in the field of international relations, that morals really don't matter all that much. Or as the saying goes, interests bake the cake, and then politicians come along and pour a little icing on it to make it look pretty. The icing is morality, but the cake is baked by interests. And so everything is really national interest, and there's not much more to be said. In fact, I remember once when I was in the State Department working on nuclear issues, saying to a French official, how did he feel about some of the questions we were dealing with? And he said, I don't see any problem at all. He said, the morality doesn't interest me. It doesn't enter into my decisions. The only thing that enters into my decisions are the interests of France. And I think he knew what a profound moral judgment he just made. But for him, it wasn't a question. It was done. And people say, well, you know, there's nothing wrong with that. When President Trump says America first, you'd expect President Macron to say France first. You'd expect every leader to say my country first, because the leaders are trustees. They're not just looking at their own interests, they're fiduciaries for others. So in that sense, national interest is natural. I want to challenge that by giving you the following little thought experiment. The view that national interest is the answer blurs over the various ways in which national interest can be defined. And it's those definitions of national interest where morality comes in and plays a critical role. So imagine that you're sitting on the beach someday and you're reading a good book, maybe mine, and you're getting to a chapter and you want to finish the chapter and hear somebody in the surf saying, help, help. And you you say, gee, I really want to finish this chapter, well, you'll probably put the book down, and if they're within a reasonable distance, you'll probably go and try to pull them out of the water. Suppose, though, same scenario, and you hear somebody shouting, "Aiuta me, aiuta me." Would you stop and think, not English, I can finish the chapter? Doubtful. I'm sure you'd probably put the book down and go and help them, that the nationality of the person who's in risk would not matter much to you. And in that sense, this view that you're either a strong nationalist protecting the national interest, or you're a rootless cosmopolitan, and that the twain shall never meet is just nonsense. I think most human beings have concentric circles of senses of community and identity, and that the inner circle may be stronger than the outer circle, but there still is a sense of common humanity which does lead us to take certain actions. Now, there are limits on that. For example, third variation of this scenario, you're reading the book and you hear help, help from two spots in the surf and about 20 yards out. And one of them is another child, and one of them is your child. Would you have to flip a coin before you could make a moral choice which one to save? No, because you would have another set of moral obligations through your role as parent. In other words, there are expectations that the child has about your behavior, which put duties upon you, which you would have to fulfill. So this idea that just saying national interest answers the problem. No, the hard questions about morality are, how do you define the national interest, and has it vary in different contexts? And this sort of debate we're having in the country now, that either you're a nationalist or a rootless cosmopolitan, is a way of ducking the real questions. So the book tries to do two things. One is I try to answer the title empirically by looking at the 14 presidents who led the country since 1945 and ask, if you imagine that they hadn't had the moral views they had, would history be any different? And I think I demonstrate, you'll have to check this for yourself, that indeed the moral views of the presidents were not just icing sprinkled on the cake, they were vital ingredients of the cake. The second task in the book is that if they matter, if morals matter, then how should we think about them? I'm going to spend more time on that, but just for the first question, empirically, do they matter? Can I make the argument that people who take the cynical view of this French official, or some of my colleagues in international relations theory, will they get history wrong? And the answer is yes, they will get history wrong with that narrow, cynical view. Let me just cite one case to make that point, but as I said, you can find for yourself others as well, and that's the case of Harry Truman. Harry Truman is particularly interesting because he is famously vilified for dropping atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Indeed, there was a famous moral philosopher at Oxford who refused to attend the honorary degree ceremony for Harry Truman in 1948 because by doing that, he was ipso facto a war criminal. So she would not attend. But what's interesting is that Truman, in terms of how he saw his actions, says in his memoirs, I didn't lose much sleep over it. At that time, it wasn't clearly understood what the effects of nuclear weapons were, and the taboo against killing women and children that comes out of just war theory had been violated mercilessly, including the firebombing of Tokyo, which killed over 100,000 people. And General Groves, the head of the Manhattan Project, said that Truman was like a boy who was placed on the back of a toboggan, or maybe even the front of the toboggan, when it was already headed downhill. And possibly he could have stopped it, but not very likely. But the interesting thing is that Truman decided not to stop, or not to drop a third bomb, which existed. And he said to his friends at the time, I'm not going to kill more women and children. So there was a moral component to his answerings. But even more interesting was in 5 years later, when Truman was losing the war in Korea. The Chinese had crossed the Yalu, were pushing us down to the bottom of the peninsula, and he was warned that if this war was lost or stalemated, it would be the end of his presidency, which it was. And General MacArthur said, I want permission to drop 25 to 40 atomic bombs on Chinese cities. And Truman said no. Now, partly that was prudence. The Allies, like Britain, didn't want that. But it was also not to kill more women and children. Truman said, I'm not going to do this. And it's fascinating to me. Imagine Truman had made that decision in a different way. Tom Schelling said in his Nobel laureate lecture that basically the development of the nuclear taboo, that nuclear weapons were not warfighting weapons, but were for deterrence, was the single most important thing that happened after 1945. And imagine what the world would look like today if Truman had decided that otherwise, that nuclear weapons were regular warfighting weapons. The world will look very different today. So I would submit that as a case as to why morals matter, in the sense that the moral views of Harry Truman were part of the ingredients of the cake, not icing dribbled on top. But there are other cases as well, which I'm not going to have time to go into. But the point is that the cynical view that it's all icing dribbled on top and not an ingredient of the national interest strikes me as inadequate history. But if we accept that morals matter, then how should we think about them? And this is what I'm more interested in trying to explain how we do that. And so the second part of the book is the second task of the book is what you might call normative theory for international relations, which is deficient in normative theory. If you look at the way people approach moral issues, there is a long tradition of American exceptionalism. We are a moral people. If we did it, it's moral. Well, that's a non sequitur, as I'm sure you know. Or people say it turned out all right, therefore it's moral. No, also a non sequitur. Or our intentions were good, and even if it didn't turn out so well, our intentions were fine, and that makes it moral. My argument in the book is that all these are cop-outs. And again, I illustrate this with sort of a homely example. I argue that you have to think of morality in 3 dimensions. You have to look at the motives, the means, and the consequences, and you have to balance all 3 of those, and that only looking at one of these is not adequate. So for example, if somebody said to you, your daughter has SAT exams tomorrow morning, she's out at the high school dance, I will drive her home and I'll make sure I get her home early. And you say, thank you, that's really nice of you. And he picks up your daughter, doesn't notice that it's rained, the road is slick, drives too fast, skids off the road, hits a tree, and your daughter is killed. Would you say, well, that's okay, his intentions were good? Of course not. You'd say inappropriate means and failure to do due diligence, thinking through unintended consequences, and the net effect is a horrible, immoral action. Now, if you take that example and apply it to international relations, apply that to the invasion of Iraq in 2003. It's a pretty close fit. People like to say Bush lied and people died. I actually don't believe that. I think that Bush probably, it was a pretty broad consensus in intelligence communities, not just here, but around the world, that Saddam had weapons of mass destruction. That he didn't was not Bush's fault. I mean, Bush had reason to believe it. And I think Bush also believed that by democratizing Iraq, he was going to be able to transform the Middle East and get rid of the roots of terrorism. So let's grant him good intentions. We can debate it, but let's, for the sake of argument, just grant him good intentions. But then ask about the means, the equivalent of driving too fast on a wet road. He did not have the capability to reform Iraq. He had the capability to remove Saddam Hussein, which he did in very short order with military force. But transforming Iraq and transforming the Middle East, he didn't have the capability. And what's more, there were people who warned him about that. There were stacks of studies done in the State Department and in the intelligence communities talking about how difficult this would be. And Colin Powell famously asked for a one-on-one with Bush and elucidated the Pottery Barn principle at that point. You break it, you own it. But he also went into the reasons why. Bush ignored that and went ahead, and the net result, the consequences, where you had an acceleration of a civil war between Sunni and Shia. You had a strengthening of al-Qaeda in Iraq, which eventually led to ISIS. So pretty horrific consequences, a little bit like hitting the tree and killing your daughter. And for people to say, well, his intentions were good, that's not enough. You have to ask, did he think through the means? And if he didn't have them, did he adjust his goals and intentions? And if not, did he make enough of an effort to understand the potential of unintended consequences to do a reasonable job on it? We always have unintended consequences, but what we often do is we say, you're responsible to do due diligence, and if you don't do due diligence, you're guilty of culpable negligence in the legal terminology. And I think you can make the case that that was what we found in Iraq. So the typical way of justifying these things, Ari Fleischer, Bush's press secretary, justified Bush's invasion of Iraq by saying he had extraordinary moral clarity. And I argue that's not enough. You have to have not only moral clarity in your intentions and motives, you also have to have moral clarity about the choice of means and about the due diligence you do in terms of thinking of potentially immoral, unintended consequences. So that's what I mean by three-dimensional morality. The idea, of course, for those of you who are interested in just war theory and the roots of this type of thinking, go all the way back to Augustine in the 4th century, where you have to have just cause, proportionate and discriminatory means, and a reasonable prospect of success. So I'm not original in looking at three dimensions of morality, but I do think that that tradition, which has been secularized and built into international humanitarian law, the Geneva Conventions, and also into the Uniform Code of Military Justice for the American military, is an appropriate way to do this. And the usual American exceptionalism or moral clarity and other such arguments that people use to justify immoral actions are largely a cop-out. Now, let me say a little bit more about motives, means, and consequences. One is on motives. It's not just the stated intentions or the vision that the president expresses. In a democracy, it'd be rare for a president to say, I have bad motives or I have bad intentions. They're all going to say it's good. The question is, do they have the emotional IQ, the ability to manage their emotions and their emotional needs to keep the stated intentions in line with what they're actually doing? And I'll give you an example of this, is this difference between Jack Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson on Vietnam. George Bundy, who was a hawk on Vietnam for both Kennedy and Johnson, was later asked, what do you think Kennedy would have done if he'd not been assassinated? Bundy said, I think Kennedy, after re-election, would have got out. And I don't think Johnson, well, we know that Johnson didn't until too late. And Bundy's argument, reinforced by people like Doris Kearns Goodwin and others, is that Kennedy wanted to be seen as smart. Johnson wanted to be seen as not a coward. And if you go back to Johnson's background in macho Texas upbringing, the idea of being the man who lost Vietnam and being seen as a coward deterred him from taking steps that he might otherwise have taken. He famously said, this bitch of a war is keeping me away from the woman I love, the Great Society. And he knew that, he intuited it, but emotionally he couldn't quite cope with the idea that giving up Vietnam, he would be basically seen as a coward. So motives involve not just stated intent, but the emotional twists and turns that a given leader makes to those as he or she tries to apply them. On means, let me just give you an example from the question of lying. Do you want to have a president who never lies? I suspect if you think about that, the answer would be, no, I don't want a president who never lies. Suppose there's about to be a raid on bin Laden, and a reporter says, I hear that you're about to do this. Do you want the president to tell the reporter the truth? I wouldn't. I mean, there's certain things in which a president has to have dirty hands as a trustee or fiduciary, and he has to do things that you might say in his personal life you would not approve of. But the difference that one has to look at are the types of lies and the quantity of lies. For example, Franklin Roosevelt told a lot of lies, some of them pretty big. You know, in 1941, when he wanted to get the Americans into Hitler's war to meet the threat that Hitler posed to us, and the Americans were staunchly isolationist, President Roosevelt invented or reinvented a episode called the Greer Incident, in which a American destroyer, the Greer, fired on a German submarine, and Roosevelt reported it to the American people as the submarine fired first, which was just the opposite of what happened. And of course, Lyndon Johnson at the time of the Gulf of Tonkin resolution even said about the second attack, those crazy sailors were probably shooting at flying fish, but he wanted a blank check from the Congress to give him rights to do what he did in Vietnam. So we've seen presidents lie and have some pretty big lies. What's different, I think, about today and President Trump's lies is the sheer quantity. If the Washington Post fact checkers are even 50% correct, that President Trump has told something like 15,000 lies in the first 1,000 days in office, that debases the currency. I mean, that so destroys credibility that if you have a crisis or something where you have to stand up and say something, nobody's going to believe you. And by debasing the currency, you have an immoral effect, not just in telling the lie, but in terms of destroying it credibility for when you might need it or the country might need it later. So means, again, it's not always just either or, it's how much of an inappropriate means you use. And as for consequences, I've mentioned the question of the example of the Iraq War. And there, I think what we have to realize is that there are some extreme circumstances, of which I don't think Iraq was one, where survival is at stake. and where you have to want a president to do things, or a leader to do things, which are really quite abhorrent. A president is a trustee, a fiduciary, and there may be times when, as the moral philosophy phrase goes, he or she has to have dirty hands. The famous ticking time bomb example is often cited. You know, if I don't torture this prisoner and find out where the bomb is or the fuse is, 1 million people may die. You might say torture is abhorrent to me personally, but I can't see the death of 1 million people just because I keep my purity. And that reached, I think, probably one of the most interesting aspects of that was when Winston Churchill in 1940 was faced with what to do about the French fleet after the British were driven into the sea at Dunkirk, and he attacked his allies and killed 1,300 French sailors. You say, God, that's pretty awful. Except if the Germans had captured the French fleet, the ability of the Royal Navy to protect the island of Britain might have been impossible. So there's an action which we would all see, I think, as abhorrent, to kill 1,300 of your own allies. But if it's a matter of survival, you might say, yuck. But you know, that's something that can be accepted in that circumstance. The problem with so many people, particularly the ultra realists, is they treat the whole world as though it's 1940 and Churchill's decision at sea. So, for example, when the Saudis dismembered Jamal Khashoggi in the consulate at Istanbul, President Trump's comment was not to condemn it. It was to say, it's a tough world out there. In other words, he was treating this violation of human rights by an alleged ally as though it was like Hitler about to take over the French fleet in 1940. It's not. And that inability to make distinctions is the real problem, I think, in cases like this. So there can be circumstances where you could imagine basically accepting some actions which would be personally abhorrent, but in those circumstances are justifiable. The problem is to treat the whole world as though it's that way. As I say to some of my international relations theorist friends, I regard myself as a realist in the sense that I say, always start with realism, but don't stop there. And too many realists start and stop at the same place, as though it's all survival or all narrow-based national interest. In fact, most of the hard questions are in that vast area in between. And in that sense, I think it was interesting that the Wall Street Journal, the conservative newspaper, condemned President Trump for his failure to stand up for human rights in the Khashoggi case. Finally, as we think about consequences, there is an issue of not just the act consequences of a particular action, but what you might call in philosophy rule utilitarianism, or what is the effect not just on this particular action, what is the effect on the set of rules that surrounds this and future actions? In other words, when I think about consequences, I have to think of the effects on institutions, not just on whether this particular little action turned out well. And there, I think that institutions matter in international relations because they essentially create an environment in which you can do things with more leeway on morality. There was a famous case in which the political scientist Robert Axelrod did a computer tournament modeling the game of Prisoner's Dilemma, which many international relations textbooks start out with international relations is like Prisoner Dilemma, you either cheat on the other guy or he cheats on you. And it's a zero-sum game. There's nothing to be done about it. That's international relations because there's no higher government and so forth. And what Axelrod did with his computer tournament is show that if you play Prisoner's Dilemma once, probably you'll cheat. But that over a long time of playing Prisoner's Dilemma again and again and again, the optimal strategy is reciprocity, tit for tat. And tit for tat then develops the capacity not to like or love your neighbor or the other person, but to say, we're both better off if you cooperate, I cooperate, you defect, I defect, and we go on like that. And eventually we learn a pattern of saying we're better off with more cooperation over time than not. That is basically what Axelrod calls the long shadow of the future, or thinking of institutions and rules when you think about consequences and not just one-time transactions as you make your consequences, your calculation of consequences. And that's a big difference between the transactional approach, which we see in the government today, and what George Shultz, when he worked for Ronald Reagan, said about foreign policy. He said, it's like growing a garden. You weed a little here, you trim a little there, you water a bit there, but it's over a long run that you cultivate this garden, which is a very different approach to the way, for example, that Secretary of State Pompeo put it when he said all these institutions are bad for the United States. They're like Gulliver and the Lilliputians. We're the biggest kid, we're the Gulliver. By paying these institutions, we're letting the Lilliputians tie us down. We've got to break through this and take full advantage of our greater strength. That might be true transaction by transaction. It's not true if you take Schultz's metaphor of a long-term thinking of growing a garden, or if you take Axelrod's point about having a long shadow of the future. And institutions cast a long shadow of the future. So as you think of consequences, you have to think not just of dire consequences of survival on one extreme, but also what you might call a rule utilitarian respect for institutions and in the longer term. So to conclude all this, I should say, as I look over the 14 presidents since 1945, I divided them into three categories. The top quartile, who I gave top marks for, meeting my three criteria, my three dimensions, were Roosevelt, Truman, Eisenhower, and the first Bush 41. And the worst, the bottom quartile, on foreign policy, I ranked LBJ, Nixon, Bush 43, and tentatively Trump. I say tentatively because he's not complete yet, so you'd have to give him a grade of incomplete, but with a note from the teacher says needs further attention. And the other presidents I stretch out in between, in the middle of the group. Now, in concluding, let me say I'm much less convinced by any of my scores or scorecards. I might want to change my own judgment. I've changed my judgment from positions I've held in the past. As we gain more information, as we have different contexts, it'd be surprising if I at least didn't change some of my views that I've printed scorecards. So I'm not wedded to my particular scoring. What I am wedded to is the idea that you need a three-dimensional scoring system, that you need to go beyond he had moral clarity, or he had clean hands, or he tried to have good consequences. And you have to think of how you weigh all three of these as you assess a foreign policy of a president over time. And that basically is the lesson. As Henry Kissinger once put it, the hardest decisions are often in the 5149 place. And when you weigh up these three different dimensions, you often find a lot of 5149 types of decisions. But there's a big difference between being torn on something like that and simply saying he had moral clarity, or we're Americans and therefore it's good. So that's the purpose of the book, to prove empirically that morals do matter and to lay out a framework which has its deep roots in just war theory of how to think about an approach to making normative judgments. So that's it.
I'm going to keep a list, and we're going to have a, I'm going to keep a list, and we're going to be having a microphone. So when I call on you, if you could state your name and your affiliation, and then ask a question. And if you make a comment, you have to promise to say, "Isn't that right, Professor?" Bill Perry.
Joe, how would you,
Wait for the mic, Bill.
how would you assess the moral clarity point of view?
Is it on?
It's now functioning.
No.
Better without it.
Yeah.
Better without it, and I'll repeat it because it is being podcast. So, Bill.
I'd like to go back to Truman's decision not to use nuclear weapons in Korea. Looking at that from the analysis you've done, how would you assess each of those three viewpoints, those three dimensions?
For those people who can't hear Secretary Bill Perry's comment, and question was, how would you assess Harry Truman's decision not to use nuclear weapons during the Korean War based on the three criteria that Joe Nye laid out as being necessary on all three dimensions in order to evaluate the moral quality of a decision?
I think, Bill, if I look at the Korean decision not to use nuclear weapons, I think on motives, I think Truman did indeed care about not killing a lot of innocent civilians, women and children. He has said that to staff and others. And since he had to pay a fairly high political price for it and knew he would pay a high political price for it, I would argue that his motives were indeed quite good on that. He had the emotional intelligence to be able to stick with that. Truman, you know, as David McCulloch says in his biography of Truman, said Truman knew who he was. He was a little man from Missouri who never went to college, but he knew who he was in terms of a deep integrity. On means, I think Truman, having watched what happened after Hiroshima and Nagasaki, I think he regarded the means of bombing 25 Chinese cities as disproportionate and violating rules of discrimination. On consequences, I'm not sure he thought through fully the consequences. He didn't have Tom Schelling's 2020 hindsight about the importance of a nuclear taboo, but I think he felt that if he let this go, if he did use the weapons this way, things were going to get out of control. There are going to be unintended consequences. So I think he passes the test on all three dimensions.
Yeah, I would just add that when Harry Truman said he never lost a moment's sleep over dropping the bomb, I think his later behavior suggests he said that so often because it wasn't true. He had lost a lot of sleep over it. Phil?
Bill Taubman, based here at CSAC. Joe, could you apply your analysis to two episodes in Bush 43? The first one is the use of waterboarding and other methods of torture or harsh interrogation. Some people would argue they fall within the ticking time bomb analysis. And the other is his initiation of all of the intrusive surveillance programs. In both cases, they were based on a belief I think he had that he might be helping to prevent the next 9/11. Thanks.
Yes, I think it's easy to condemn both of these, from where we sit now, and I do, but I think somewhat of a mitigating factor is the belief that there was about to be a huge disaster. I mean, the Twin Towers and the Pentagon attacks had just occurred, and there was a lot of chatter in the intelligence community that another was coming soon. And in addition to that, you had this crazy set of episodes of anthrax, which just poured fuel on the fire. It had nothing to do, we now know in retrospect, it had nothing to do with Al Qaeda, but it was an American rogue scientist, if you want. But they didn't know that. And so in their minds, they were on the brink of something truly catastrophic happening again. And I think that's why they crossed the line. I think what's interesting is that on the second one of these, the intrusion into electronic surveillance, there were people in the administration, good conservative lawyers, who said no, like my colleague Jack Goldsmith, and who just said no. We've gone too far on this, and so in that sense, there was an ability to right the system somewhat within the system. On the enhanced interrogation, they told themselves a lie to make it more comfortable, that it wasn't torture. And they had these psychologists working for the CIA who said that we trained it on others, so forth. So there was a way in which they made it less difficult for their consciences. I think you could have had better procedures, even when you're that frightened, to make sure that you're not crossing these lines. But I do think that, in fairness, one has to ask, what did they believe at the time? And I think they did have, and some cause to believe, that there might be an impending or imminent disaster. So I don't, from hindsight, I don't justify it, but I'm trying to put it in the context of the time.
Two questions in the back. First, Alan Weiner, and then after him, then Reed Pauley.
Thank you. I'm Alan Weiner from the law school. I teach, among other things, just war theory with Scott Sagan.
Well, then you're ahead of me.
So I had a question about the first test and the means of judging the motives, and what your kind of theory is about normative good in terms of judging a motive. So I'm thinking in particular about humanitarian intervention cases. We used force in Kosovo to save lives. There are many other circumstances in which we haven't. That's often justified as based on what America's interests in different regions of the world are. And so I'm wondering if we should judge the morality of our action or inaction according to an abstract principle like saving lives, which we would apply universally, or do we think that some lives matter more than others because of our interests? And if interests are embedded into the normative calculation, isn't there an endogeneity problem that kind of undoes the anti-realist argument that you're making?
Well, I think this is a horrible thing to say, but if you go back to my example about the beach, some lives do matter more than others. In other words, if you just do a simple utilitarian calculus of saving numbers of lives, I think it is too easy. That ultra-cosmopolitan view, Peter Singer's view, washes out the fact that institutions exist and that we have differential loyalties, and along with differential loyalties and sense of community come different obligations. So the reason I added that third case about lying on the beach was, yes, there shouldn't be a distinction whether I save somebody who's speaking English or a foreigner. But there is a reason why I first try to save my child and not the undifferentiated child whose nationality I don't know or not. And so I do think that as if you think of international relations and you try to squeeze it all into a simple cosmopolitanism, I'll again attack Peter Singer as a radical utilitarian cosmopolitan, you're missing the fact that we live in different nations, that we have different obligations that go with that. On the other hand, if you go to the other extreme and say, okay, that means only American lives matter, and therefore I can kill as many others as I want. No, we have rules and norms that are trying to protect against that. You know, if I know that there's a terrorist in a apartment building and that there are 70 families living in that building, but I know that if I drop a big enough bomb, I'll get the terrorist, and I do, but I kill 70 families, we don't justify that because the means are inappropriate. So in between the complete cosmopolitan, who's a pure utilitarian, all lives matter equally, we just calculate number of lives, and the complete nationalist or narrow national interest, it's only my nationality that matters. The hard moral choices are in between, and that's why we have things like just war theory, international humanitarian law, and the Uniform Code of Military Justice, because that's where the hard moral choices are. This is why you and Scott are going to have to keep teaching.
Is there a morally relevant difference between Kosovars and Rwandans?
Not in my view, as having done my opening field work in Uganda, and as somebody who visited Rwanda when I worked for Bill Perry, I don't see that there's, but you could make an argument that if you add national interest, which is our concern about Europe as an area which is central to our view of NATO and so forth, that I'm willing to take more risks in Kosovo than I am in Rwanda. But again, the interesting questions are not either or, all or nothing. The interesting questions is we could have done much more in Rwanda. We couldn't have saved 800,000 Tutsis. We didn't have to pull out our support for the UN peacekeepers. We could have provided supplies. We didn't have to send the 82nd Airborne, but we could have been much more forceful in trying to recruit African countries to send troops and provide the intelligence and logistics for them. And we couldn't have saved everybody, but we could have saved a lot more, and we should have.
Reed.
Hi, thank you. I'm Reed Pauley, a fellow here at CSAC, former fellow at the Harvard Kennedy School. My question, sir, is about interpreting historical speech evidence as to whether it is a moral argument or not. I've struggled with this a little bit in my own work, looking at, for instance, decisions to use or not use nuclear weapons in war games conducted in the Pentagon. Right? If somebody sitting around the table says, I do not want to use nuclear weapons because world opinion will turn against us, or the American people would not support it, right? These are consequence arguments, or I might call them reputational arguments about the costs of an action. However, they're said in a context, the bowels of the Pentagon, in which those arguments might actually just be more convincing, and those who are saying them wish to be making a moral argument or an ethical trade-off, but they're using the language of reputation and consequences. When you see that in your cases, in presidential speech evidence, do you interpret that as a moral choice? Or can we sometimes actually just make reputational judgments absent ethics?
Well, there's a tendency for some philosophers and some politicians to distinguish prudence from morality. And I have a long section of the book rejecting that. If you ask what goes into moral reasoning or our moral decisions, we know that different parts of the brain light up for different actions. The famous trolley car problem, that I can throw a switch to divert the trolley car that will kill 5 people or kill 1 person. I'll throw the switch so that it kills 1 rather than 5. But if I have the choice of pushing somebody onto the track to derail the trolley car, even though 5 people will die if I don't push 1 person, I can't do it. The utilitarian calculation, those 2 cases are exactly the same. However, in terms of how it affects me in terms of something, you know, sometimes, to put it simply, it's either intuitive or some people call it the yuck factor. It just can't do that. And people find that different parts of the brain light up for both of those. Nonetheless, when we make moral decisions, we sometimes make utilitarian moral decisions. We sometimes make intuitive, or if you want, deontological moral decisions. And the argument that it's you're either a pure deontologist like Immanuel Kant, or it's all prudence. That again oversimplifies the problem. In reality, we wind up using both of these all the time, and particularly in international relations where scenarios and situations are so complex, there's bound to be an interaction of these two. And to try to pretend that one is moral and the other is prudential, and therefore there's no problem, is, it's just not reality. Max Weber got this right 100 years ago. Said if you're a politician, you can't afford just the ethics of conviction, a la Martin Luther. You have to have an ethic of responsibility. But if you have an ethic of responsibility, doesn't mean you can't also have conviction. And that essay of Weber's, Politics as a Vocation, still stands in my mind as the classic in answering your question.
Let me ask a follow-on to Reed's question, which is, can you give an example from your research for this book where you saw or read a statement, and then as you did more research on the backstory, you changed your judgment, either from what you thought was a poor, immoral decision that now you understood it to be based more on your criteria, or the opposite, where you thought it was really horrible, the opposite, where you thought it was really positive, and then you said, no, that was rhetoric and that wasn't.
Well, the Truman nuclear issue is a good example of that. I mean, I think before I started working on the book, I thought that I begrudgingly felt that Truman dropping the bomb in Hiroshima is a little bit like Churchill bombing the French fleet. I said, awful, but you didn't have much choice given where we were at the time. But then I realized that Truman's motives, when he first said, the part where he said, I didn't lose sleep over it, which I think you're right that he did lose sleep over it, but I think that early stage, it would have been extremely difficult to imagine Truman stopping that. I mean, the whole machinery of government, the whole climate of how the just war theory had been eviscerated by, bombing cities in Europe way before we got to firebombing Tokyo and so forth. I think for Truman to have stopped that would have been, I think he had to see that as this is a practical thing. It's all been planned. It's all been worked out. You're going to have one uranium bomb, one plutonium bomb, bing, bing. The fact that he didn't do the third bomb is what I found most interesting. And I hadn't focused on that in my own mind. And the fact that the first part of his decision, I think, was largely practical utilitarian. The fact that he didn't use the third bomb, I think, was moral intuitive, to go back to that distinction.
Don Emerson?
Yeah, Don Emerson, Asia Pacific Research Center. One of the attractive things of your project, it seems, from my point of view, is that rather than write a book that would sort of investigate theories of just war and the kind of the philosophical perspective on the topic, you've got a series of historical case studies. And that means that the empirics are front and center. And so there's a kind of practical advantage as opposed to the philosophical advantage that I think you enjoy. At the same time, you open yourself to the kind of question that I'm going to ask. Namely,
But
given all of those cases, right, it's tempting to ask, what is the lesson of that history? Now, we could debate whether history rhymes or repeats and so forth. Leaving that debate aside, there are a couple of points in your comments, I haven't obviously read the book, that would suggest an applicability to a future situation. For example, the notion that you start with realism, but you don't end there. That's very intriguing. And I want to know what happens when you kind of go over the cliff, when you don't end there, okay? You talk about the long shadow of the future, the institutional dimension. That's also, it seems to me, highly relevant. I imagine myself sitting on the beach as I'm speaking, okay? So how would you apply all of this to COVID-19, which may become a pandemic within a matter of days?
That's a hard question, Don, in the sense
Sure.
that I don't know enough about COVID-19 to give you a sensible answer. But uh, the interesting moral questions are going to balance out how much you impose isolation and quarantine as opposed to the human rights or personal rights. I think in cases like this, you are in a survival situation. There are people who, for religious reasons, resist vaccine, and we pass laws saying you have to vaccinate your kid anyway. You say, how can you violate their personal or religious rights? It goes against my grain in terms of individual rights, but it does affect the survival of the community. And I can argue that I would say, if somebody's being brought back from this cruise ship in Japan and they say, I'm perfectly healthy, let me go home. I've already been imprisoned on this damn ship for 3 weeks or whatever. And you say, no, I'm sorry, you're going to go to an Air Force base in a quarantine position for 2 weeks. I don't like that, but I think that's what you have to do. So I would say that here's a case where consequences would prevail over individual rights. Now, but again, I don't know enough about the real case of COVID-19 to give you a better answer.
I think we have a student question over here, Sammy.
Hi, I'm Sammy Thompson, and I'm an undergraduate here. And I would kind of just like to hear your take on how to apply your moral framework to kind of overall foreign policy, specifically looking at, like, say, Russia's aggressive actions as of late. Like, how much is on the United States to support, say, like democracy promotion, like Bush. Bush was supported the color revolutions, but that in turn antagonized Russian aggression back for us, and that we don't necessarily have foreign or economic like hard interests there. How much are we supposed to promote these morals, even though it goes along with democracy promotion and what we feel? But yeah.
Well, it's a very important question you're raising, and it particularly is interesting in areas of human rights, because with human rights cases, it's often not a pure either or. But it usually on human rights issues, you're doing a trade-off among different values. Some of my friends who are human rights specialists sort of say human rights ought to be the guide of our foreign policy. But if you have a pure human rights policy, you don't have a foreign policy. A foreign policy is a situation where you're trading off a number of values: survival, economic, social solidarity values, and you can't have all good things don't go in the same direction in the same degree at the same time. So you're going to wind up with trade-offs. So to go back to the case of Trump and Khashoggi, what Trump said is, look, we have interests in oil, we have interests in stability in the region, we have interests in selling them armaments, it's good for our industry, we have a whole series of interests, and he said, it's a rough world out there, therefore I can blow this off. And the critics, including the Wall Street Journal, said, we also have another interest, which is our values. Our values, it's not, people often say it's values versus interests. Our values are also an interest. When we stand up for certain values, we're more likely to attract others, what I call soft power. And when you don't use your soft power, you're trading away something that's very important. So it's not that we don't have interest in oil and stability in the region. It's we also have an interest in our values, both intrinsically for who we are, but also extrinsically in terms of an instrument that provides soft power for us. And if you want to follow this, I have an article in the New York Times op-ed section today about how Trump has undercut American soft power. And it says, no, Mr. President, you haven't made America great again. We're weaker on our soft power than ever before, and I can prove it with polls. I mean, the data is there. It's not just my partisan preferences. So I think the question you raise is extremely important, but you can't answer it by just saying, you know, always human rights, or it's a rough world out there, forget human rights. The hard choices are in between.
Brett McGurk, and Brett, could you explain not just what you're doing here now, but what your last jobs were?
Well, I know his last job.
You do, but not everybody does.
I'm Brett McGurk at CSAC, and I served under Bush, Obama, and Trump in various positions. I'm here writing a book about ends, ways, and means, and what happens where there's a gap between your objectives and your means, and often the unintended consequences that follow, to put it mildly. But I hadn't thought about it in terms of a moral prism, so I really look forward to reading the book. And just one question about the means of first resort today are sanctions, broad-based sanctions. So if you take Venezuela, Iran, and Syria, I think the objectives, we want to try to restrain, even possibly have those regimes transition out of power, which might be a moral objective good given the odious nature of those regimes. But the means of broad-based sanctions have tremendous consequences on the population, and there's really no empirical support that sanctions can deliver those types of broad objectives. So you end up actually impoverishing countries, having tremendous humanitarian effect for an objective that might be unattainable. But because Trump resorts to not just but really broad-based sectoral sanctions, how would you analyze that through your prism?
Well, sanctions are one arrow in our quiver. Trump has used that arrow more than any others. He tends to be something of an economic determinist as he approaches foreign policy. But what you said is correct, that we have over time come to realize that sanctions often hurt those who shouldn't be hurt. And there has been a movement of people who write about the sanctions and think about sanctions to move away from broad-based sanctions to targeted sanctions. So the difference between sanctions which punish the population as a whole, particularly in dictatorships where they can't do anything about, you know, what's happening, and sanctions which punish those who can do something. So the sanctions that are attacking the bank accounts in Switzerland of an oligarch are different from sanctions which impoverish the people as a whole. And I think, or the sanctions in the monetary area, you know, of using SWIFT transfers to get at their financial resources and so forth. So I think we ought to be a lot more careful about broad-based sanctions, because they often inflict harm on people who don't deserve harm. Now, there is an argument. I had this argument with a friend who's an expert on Venezuela, who said he had the view that I just expressed, but he felt that unless you increase the pain in Venezuela, in other words, the efforts to just target Maduro and his henchmen had clearly not worked. And he said he'd reluctantly came around to the view of you need to punish more people to create a climate where you could try to get them to bargain for their exit or something. I'm still not completely convinced by it, but that's the nature of the trade-off. You're inflicting a lot of harm on innocent people, and if they can't do anything about it, and if it's not going to have causal effectiveness, I don't see why that's all that different from dropping the bomb on the apartment to kill one terrorist.
There's we had that scenario in Syria, actually.
Yeah.
And one guy in a building with 300 people.
What happened?
Pretty dangerous guy. We waited for him. We waited months for him to walk outside.
Yeah, well, that's the American way of doing things. That's not the Russian way of doing things.
Alicia Chen?
Hi, Professor. I'm Alicia. I'm a master's student at FSI, and I also work for Professor Sagan. I had a question. You started your talk really talking about how morality can play a role in defining our national interest, and you talk about it as as some universal thing, this common humanity thing. And we're really judging, when we're judging the foreign policy actions of these presidents, we're judging them as a society. Yet your analysis is very leader centric, and we kind of have to depend on the leader to correct their own behavior. And so I'm wondering how you view, we as a society, we as citizens of a country, how we shape the national interest of those, and how we bring our own moralities in shaping that interest. Thank you.
Well, we do it through our expressions, through of views, through our how we vote, for the how we write op-ed pieces. I mean, there is. I mean, Scott has done some very interesting work about the variation in American public opinion about some of the. It's not as though we all have the same view. There are large differences in the moral views among Americans. On the other hand, you could argue that, and this changes with time, it doesn't stay constant. But for example, go back to human rights. Franklin Roosevelt talked a bit about human rights in the Atlantic Declaration in 1941 with Churchill. But to tell you the truth, there was a bit of icing on the cake about that. But when Jimmy Carter became president, he really cared about human rights. And it led to some very interesting questions. I mean, there was a pushback from some in the Congress, some in the press, and so forth. But Carter was expressing something which, in the aftermath of Vietnam, there was quite a change in the American public views on many moral issues, including human rights. There's a case to be made that in the post-World War II period, that there is a significant changing point with Watergate, with Vietnam and Watergate. And so the public mood, the public demand for more morality in foreign policy does increase. And it's interesting that, so that represents citizens. Remember the Church Committee hearings in the 1970s, and they led Gerald Ford to take a number of actions. I mean, not only led to the various things we know about of Congress being more assertive, but Ford said, we will no longer do assassinations. During the Cold War, we tried to assassinate Castro, Lumumba, several others, and we regarded that as a normal instrument of foreign policy. Ford, after Vietnam, in the climate of changed public opinion, issued an executive order saying we're not going to do that anymore. What's interesting is that may be reversed again. If you look at Trump's assassination of Soleimani, it's not that Soleimani was a good guy and should be protected, but the idea that you kill a high official of another government in a third country is a violation of this norm that Ford had begun to restore. And, you know, question is that in our interest to go back to that Cold War approach to it? What happens when some Iranian shoots Mike Pompeo in Baghdad? How can we object after we've said assassination is back? So, I mean, there are in the current mood, on the assassination, we've gone from accepting assassination to officially rejecting it, to now, it seems to me, we're back toward accepting it. So it doesn't mean there's always moral progress.
A two-finger here from Len Weiss.
I have one too.
Okay.
Yeah.
Hi, Joe. Nice to see you. Wait for the mic, Len, and then keep it, because there's somebody else here and here.
Nice to see Joe Nye again after a number of years. Actually, I think I saw you last year, as a matter of fact, so it hasn't been that long. My question, my two-finger.
Identify yourself, Len.
Oh, I'm here as an affiliate of CSAC.
And an old colleague from non-proliferation days in Washington.
Every president, I mean, the question of assassination of Soleimani or whatever brings to mind the question of the assassination of al-Awlaki. Here, this was not a case of a foreign, a person from a foreign government basically being considered a threat to the United States, but an American citizen who was neither charged with nor convicted of any crime. Yet he was targeted for assassination, and they carried it out. Later, they killed his son as well. Where is the sort of the morality of that situation? And I would say beyond that, when a president makes a decision like that or anything else, there is always a domestic political consideration involved that affects the president's chances for reelection or other interests that he may have personally. So at what point do political considerations become morally suspect because of the fact that they've been given too much weight?
Yes, keep the mic coming out here. We've got a second, and why don't you take them both? From Phil Taubman again.
Yeah, I just had the historical footnote when you talked about Jimmy Carter and what he did about human rights. Of course, it was also Jimmy Carter who said, "I will never tell you a lie."
On Len's question of the Awlaki case, it's a hard one. I think, and you can broaden it beyond just Awlaki to, well, then how do you justify killing bin Laden and not Soleimani? I mean, what's the distinction? The traditional distinction has been between state and non-state actors. Once you identify another state as a terrorist state or the IRGC as a terrorist organization of the state, you're beginning to blur a distinction which is important. We've tended to say that killing large numbers of innocent civilians for political purposes is terror. And we've said that that is tends to be done by non-state actors. But we get into situations where you say, well, somebody like Soleimani not only killed American soldiers in Iraq, but he killed a certain number of Sunni civilians and women and children and so forth. So why make these distinctions? And I think it's, you say, well, if we have a Vienna Convention on diplomatic immunities, which makes this distinction, we ought to keep it. Not that it's perfect, but you ought to keep it. So I would argue that Soleimani and bin Laden, just to stick with that for a second, are indeed different. That killing bin Laden, who is a non-state actor who has declared war on us, is justifiable. And Soleimani, who is a state actor who has acted in war against us, we ought to kill him on the battlefield, but not in a third country's capital. Now, you can say that's too fine a distinction, but once you start losing those distinctions, then the whole thing becomes a slippery slope. Now, let me finish it by taking it to Awlaki. I likened Awlaki, who's an American citizen, to bin Laden in a sense that of having declared war on the United States, even though he was an American citizen. So that would put Awlaki in the category with bin Laden rather than the category of Soleimani. But it gets to be fine distinctions on some of this.
Two finger from Alan, and then I'll go back to the main list. Just stand up. We don't have the mic.
Just a very small two finger on this because it comes up a lot. The designation of the IRGC or Soleimani as a terrorist entity for U.S. law purposes is not the legal basis under either U.S. law or international law for our targeting him. That's a widely held misconception. There have been long talks at the law school about what exactly the legal justification was, but the designation of him as a terrorist is not. There are 50 organizations on the U.S. terrorist list, and we would never take the position that members of any of those organizations can be targeted.
Mm-hmm. Tom Finger.
Thank you, Joe. Tom Finger, a fellow here at FSI.
Again, a former colleague.
Yes, successor. Maybe not worthy.
That's right.
I wonder if you could speak to the interplay of idiosyncratic factors, the personalities of individuals making decisions, and structural or systemic factors, rules of decision. That if the proposition that moral decisions are in many respects better than immoral decisions, we don't want to rely simply on the idiosyncratic aspects of individual leaders. What are the lessons from your study here for increasing the likelihood of more weight, proper weight being given to the moral considerations?
Well, I think we shouldn't make the mistake of saying that moral decisions are ipso facto better than amoral decisions. For example, on the case that I gave of George W. Bush in Iraq, I think you can argue that in his intent, his intent was moral. But when I didn't have time to get into this, in the category of intent and means, intent and motives, I distinguish between having good intentions and being able to manage your motives to fit that. But then there's a second category in that first area, which is a degree of prudence. And this is where I bring prudence in, which if you have a vision, it's a great moral vision, but it has no relation to reality, it can be a very bad thing. If I'm a Pied Piper and I lead a lot of people over a cliff, I might believe that I'm doing a good thing, but I'm not. So I argue that you have to build the prudence into your vision to make your goals. It's not just moral clarity, it's moral clarity plus a degree of feasibility. And so having a moral goal per se is not sufficient. Or if you want a harder case on this is, I praised Harry Truman on Korea, but there's the original decision that Truman made in June of 1950 to respond to Kim Il-sung's invasion of the South. Because remember, Truman's Secretary of State earlier that year had said Korea was outside our defense perimeter, which was an invitation to Kim Il-sung to go in. And Ernest May, my former colleague at Harvard, historian, did a very careful study of this, said Truman's response to the invasion of South Korea was axiomatic. In other words, it so recalled Hitler's invading the Rhineland. And Truman saw this as crossing of a border in spite of the UN saying you shouldn't cross borders, and therefore it must be punished morally, even though his Secretary of State had said it's not in our realist interest. Now, was that a smart decision or not? It's hard to tell. But I mean, you know, it was a moral decision, but many people said a pure realist would have said it was a bad decision.
Melissa.
Hi, Professor. Thank you so much. My name is Melissa Carlson. I'm a predoctoral fellow here at CSAC. Excuse me. So I have two questions, and I'll make both very brief. So there's a growing body of research that suggests that multilateral interventions in conflict are perceived as being more moral than interventions that occur bilaterally or even just with a few other allies. So I was wondering if you could talk about the role of moral consensus at the time a foreign policy decision is being made, and how that should factor into kind of our post hoc assessment of foreign policy decisions. And then my second question is, you know, a lot of the examples that we've been discussing at the table are moral assessments of a particular action taking place. And I was wondering if you could speak to whether or not you think we can use the same framework to judge inaction in the face of a crisis or some type of conflict.
Those are great questions.
Pass the mic across to the gentleman in the green sweater. Who's got the next question? Go ahead.
Oh, okay. If you look at the multilateral, they aren't ipso facto better because sometimes you can have paralysis in a multilateral operation. Some UN peacekeeping operations also were poorly managed. What is it, Bangladeshi soldiers bringing typhoid to Haiti and so forth. You have cases of rape in the Congo by multilateral units. And so it's not good per se. But multilateralism does broaden the legitimacy. It's not, just our view. And it also provides a check on, the view that we start interpreting everything just through our own eyes. So I would say there's a presumption in favor of multilateralism, but it's a presumption which is not sufficient to make a final judgment on it. What was the second half was?
Inaction.
Inaction. Oh, yeah, inaction can be as important as action. And I take you back to that case of Rwanda. I was in the Clinton administration working for Bill Perry. There was a desire not to declare this genocide because it would imply that we had to do something about it. And there was also, in the aftermath of the fiasco in Somalia, the feeling that we would never get public support or congressional approval. Therefore, if we could somehow duck it, it was better. And as I mentioned a few minutes ago, there were things we could have done that didn't involve sending the 82nd Airborne, which we should have done. So I think you can make a moral condemnation of the inaction, not just the action.
Thank you. My name is Sports, and I'm a member of the community, Professor Nye. I want to go back to a series of questions that followed your response that included your op-ed article in the New York Times today. And it relates to really the use of the metrics and the criteria you've defined for defining moral action prospectively. Do you see a fundamental change in the profile of the American public sufficient from the period that the Trump administration has come into office that is indicative of a step change in how, in the future, irrespective of whether Trump is in office this election cycle or in the future, that future presidents need to be responsive to, and that this change is really not limited to Trump himself?
Well, it's a very important question, and I don't know the answer. But it's worth remembering that about a third of the American public is fundamentally isolationist. They don't give a damn about the rest of the world. And the Chicago Council on Global Affairs does a poll every 2 years with the same questions. So the variations aren't due to a change of the question. And since it usually varies somewhere between 62 to 70%. Right now, 70% of the people want an active foreign policy. And about 10 years ago, it was closer to 62%. But the less interesting than that variation of 6 or 8 points is that a third of the American people are consistently isolationist. In the 1930s, of course, that number got up to 70, 80%. And the result was disastrous. I mean, there's this great, Roosevelt comes to realize what a threat Hitler is to us after 1938. And he makes every effort to try to get us involved in the war. At one point, he turns to his press aide and says, what do you do if you're a leader in a democracy and you look over your shoulder and nobody is following? And he actually failed, except that the Japanese bailed him out at Pearl Harbor, and then Hitler helped by declaring war on the US. So we have to be careful. Do I see a swing toward 30s type isolationism? I don't think so. The polls show the opposite. But do I think that we're ever going to get rid of this lump in our stomach, which is a third of the public that says the hell with the rest of the world? I couldn't care less. No, that's always going to be there. So we're always going to have indigestion.
The bad news is that we've hit the witching hour. The good news is that Joe Nye hasn't finished his cookie. So for those of you who didn't get to ask your question, I apologize, but come up and ask Joe while he finishes his cookie, and the rest of us just thank him for the session.